Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the life and legacy of Frederick Douglass, abolitionist, advocate, and statesman. Please welcome our host, Andrew Olivastro, Vice President of Outreach at the Heritage Foundation.
Frederick Douglass was born free, but in bondage. As he wrote in My Bondage and My Freedom, for my own part, I had now become altogether too big for my chains. Thank God he did. Frederick Douglass has a majestic presence in our lives, the most photographed man of the 19th century. Frederick Douglass stirs our souls. His rhetoric could roar like a lion. It's why he was greeted with many minutes-long standing ovations after he spoke and very often before. We live in anticipation, don't we? It's also what he said. Frederick Douglass is a prophet of freedom. He rallied a nation in pursuit of our founding principles. Quote, "It is not light that we need, but fire. It is not the gentle shower, but thunder. We need the storm, the whirlwind, and the earthquake." Clearly, Frederick Douglass knew what time it was. We celebrate his example today and deeply appreciate his legacy every day, giving us a North Star and a path to pursue for posterity. That is why the Heritage Foundation is delighted to partner with the Douglass Leadership Institute in hosting today's lecture and conversation. The Douglass Leadership Institute was founded by Bishop Dean Nelson in 2015. They quickly developed a network of like-minded pastors and faith leaders across the country to lead positive change in their communities and influence policy at the local, state, and national level. On behalf of Kevin Roberts, my colleague Terrace Todd, Dean, thank you for your partnership. We look forward to you taking the stage soon and to host a conversation with our guest speaker. Our guest speaker, Dr. Lucas Morell. Lucas Morell is the John K. Boardman Jr. Professor of Politics and head of the Politics Department at Washington and Lee University. He holds a PhD in political science from the Claremont Graduate University. He is the author of several books, including Lincoln and the American Founding, of which we have copies for all of you here today in person. Dr. Morell also conducts high school teacher workshops for the Ashbrook Center, Jack Miller Institute, Gilder Lehrman Institute, Bill of Rights Institute, and Liberty Fund. He's a teacher for all of us. He's a former president of the Abraham Lincoln Institute, a founding member of the Academic Freedom Alliance, a trustee of the Supreme Court Historical Society, a consultant on the Library of Congress exhibits on Lincoln and the Civil War. He currently serves on the U.S. Semi-Quincentennial Commission, which will plan activities to commemorate the founding of the United States of America. In Frederick Douglass, The Making of an American, Dr. Morell will explore how a man who had every reason to hate America became one of the nation's strongest defenders. Sir, a former Salvatore Fellow at the Heritage Foundation, we are thrilled to have you back here. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lucas Morell.
Thank you, Andy, and the Heritage Foundation and the Douglass Leadership Institute for inviting me to speak about one of my favorite topics. My favorite, obviously, is Abraham Lincoln. Frederick Douglass is a close second. If you're on Twitter, and yes, there's some decent stuff on Twitter, my handle is Lincoln Douglass, and you bet that the Douglass is with two S's. Let's get that right. This isn't part of my remarks, and I probably shouldn't digress, but Stephen Douglas, who was Lincoln's rival and a white supremacist to the bone, he was actually born with Douglass, two S's. If you look at eBay every now and then, you'll see carte de visites, photographs of Stephen Douglas prior to the 1850s, and it is always spelled with two S's. I believe he dropped the second S once another Douglas became a prominent figure on the national stage. I can't prove this, but too good enough to check, I guess. I know Black History Month is almost over, but it's always a good time to talk about Frederick Douglass. a man who became famous for escaping a system of injustice rooted in racial prejudice, Douglass became even more famous, in my opinion, for pointing out America's systemic justice, which he found in the ideals and institutions of the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. He came to believe that these held the keys to abolition of slavery and full and equal citizenship under the law. Without the political principles and institutions that made the United States exceptional among the nations of the world at that time, America would not have seen any progress in securing the rights of its citizens, whether black or white, what I consider the long civil rights movement that constitutes this nation's history ever since 1776. Next to William Lloyd Garrison, editor of The Liberator, Frederick Augustus Bailey Douglass was America's most famous abolitionist. Born into slavery near Easton, Maryland in February 1818, he escaped 20 years later, and in 1845 published Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, and he added, written by himself. He had to say that. Soon after its publication, he had to flee the country because his autobiography and abolition speeches made him liable to capture as a fugitive slave. After speaking on the abolition circuit for 2 years in England, Ireland, and Scotland, he returned to America, but he could do so only after his manumission was purchased by friends of his on both sides of the pond. He was no longer an outlaw, but a free man in the eyes of the law. He then edited an abolition newspaper called the North Star and wrote and spoke almost daily to emancipate slaves and rid the nation of color prejudice. He followed the career of Abraham Lincoln, and during the Civil War, despite being a fierce critic of Lincoln, came to appreciate the president's efforts on behalf of emancipation and black enlistment in the armed forces. After the war, Douglass was eventually appointed U.S. Marshal for the District of Columbia and then Minister to Haiti. He was a long-time early adopter, if you will, advocate for women's rights, and had attended a meeting of the National Council of Women in Washington, D.C., the morning of his death on February 20th, 1895. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, a leading activist for women's rights, recalled watching Douglass deliver a speech. He stood there like an African prince, majestic in his wrath, as with wit, satire, and indignation, he graphically described the bitterness of slavery and the humiliation of subjection to those who in all human virtues and powers were inferior to himself. His ferocity of spirit was matched by a fierce intelligence that produced not only his renowned narrative, the first of 3 autobiographies. I have written a grand total of 0 autobiographies, but also speeches and editorials that stand as essential, critical contributions to the progress of liberty in America. That intelligence that led a man, as was mentioned earlier, had every reason to hate America to eventually become one of her greatest defenders. Douglass's journey to become one of the great abolition speakers in American history began as a personal one when he decided to free himself from the legal bondage into which he was born. In his narrative, Douglass famously recounted an incident when he decided to resist a flogging at the hands of an overseer named Edward Covey. Mr. Covey seemed to think he had me, could do what he pleased. But at this moment, from whence the spirit came, I don't know, I resolved to fight. Suiting my action to my resolution, I seized Covey hard by the throat, and as I did, I rose. Douglass called that the turning point of his career as a slave, as he put it, when he resolved that however long I might remain a slave in form, the day had passed forever when I could be a slave in fact. I did not hesitate to let it be known of me that the white man who expected to succeed in whipping must also succeed in killing me. In his 1855 autobiography, My Bondage and My Freedom, Douglass commented, "I had reached a point at which I was not afraid to die. That spirit made me a free man in fact, while I remained a slave in form." Remarkably, when his race was held against him as he exercised the legal rights of a free man, Douglass never took it to heart. One time, when he was forced to ride in the baggage car because of his, as he put it, unpopular color, white friends apologized for the insulting treatment, to which he replied, "They cannot degrade Frederick Douglass. The soul that is within me no man can degrade." A few weeks after Lincoln had issued his Emancipation Proclamation, Douglass gave a lecture entitled "Popular Error and Unpopular Truth." He said there was no such thing as a new truth. Error might be old or new, but truth was as old as the universe. Of Lincoln's proclamation, Douglass declared a fatal blow had at last been struck at the root of the gigantic evil. The president's proclamation had given the slaves the legal right to liberty. Now they could obtain their personal freedom without trampling upon civil laws. Notice Douglass's respect for the rule of law, the necessity of those laws. He recognized that his own escape, his physical escape from freedom, or to freedom, even though it was entirely just in terms of the laws of nature, it violated, at that time, the laws of men. The chief aim of self-government was to make the civil laws comport with, as the Declaration puts it, the laws of nature and of nature's God. As Douglass suggests, to act consistently with the laws of nature should never contradict the laws of one's community. He understood the purpose of government was to protect, not deprive, human beings of the liberty with which they were born. So Douglass saw the Emancipation Proclamation as securing to those enslaved by man's laws the rights they already possessed as human beings, rights that human laws should have been protecting all along. This was an important observation, born of America's own founding as a nation upon timeless truths. The idea of universal, natural rights was what Douglass considered an unpopular truth. Unpopular because until the 1770s, no nation on earth operated according to what Americans held to be self-evidently true. Douglass noted that with the Emancipation Proclamation, Mr. Lincoln had dared to apply the old truth of human liberty to this time. He has dared to declare the truth of the Declaration of Independence. With Lincoln and the American founders, Douglass believed human equality was one of those truths as old as the universe. Under the pressure of a civil war, the self-evident truth that all men are created equal would begin to be secured for Black Americans. But it was chiefly a contest of words and not a battle of arms to which Douglass attributed the abolition of slavery. Though wrung out by the stern dictates of military necessity, he declared, it was in reality a moral necessity. Without what he called a principle in man, which induces him to accept truth, Douglass held out little hope for progress in human affairs. For him, speech, meaning an appeal to right, not violence, an appeal to mere might, held the key to progress of liberty in the United States. He pointed out that it was slavery that required violations of free speech. But he was confident that truth must triumph under a system of free discussion. He even affirmed Thomas Jefferson's confidence, quote, that error might be left free so long as truth was free to combat it. Equally true, though not always equally manifest, he said, it is that error can never be safely tolerated when truth is not left free to combat it. For Douglass, freedom of speech was not an abstract principle, but the very engine, the driver of a society that intended to rule itself by reason rather than mere force or intimidation. He knew the insecurity of slaveholding societies. That led them to censor mails of abolition publications, mobbed speakers who argued for emancipation, and even prohibited the enslaved from learning how to read and gaining an education. Douglass's concern for the right to speak, as I mentioned, was not an abstract consideration. He and other abolitionists routinely faced mobs, even in New England, who tried to shut down their rallies. Below the Mason-Dixon line, slave states employed despotic measures to silence opposition. Slavery cannot tolerate free speech, he declared in 1860. They will have it. None of it there, for there they have the power. As I mentioned, they censored the mails, mobbed speakers. Describing a free mind as the dread of tyrants, Douglass observed, it is the right which they first of all strike down, the right to speak. I'll add here that Douglass would be shocked to find American universities, which should be providing a robust protection of diversity of thought, instead allowing the harassment and even the deplatforming of invited speakers. That was attempted a few years ago when I was on a Zoom debate at Middlebury University with another professor. They didn't think that the thoughts that I was going to utter were worth hearing. So they tried to get the president to close down the debate. Again, Douglass points out that it was slave societies that required violations of free speech. This required the steadfast protection of what Douglass called the right of the hearer, as well as those of the speaker. So Douglass proclaimed, liberty is meaningless where the right to utter one's thoughts and opinions has ceased to exist. He thought there can be no right of speech where any man is overawed by force and compelled to suppress their honest sentiments. Douglass felt this conviction keenly when he returned in 1847 from his self-imposed exile to the United Kingdom. While in England, Douglass had criticized the American system of slavery and was rebuked for disrespecting his country on foreign soil. In a fiery speech entitled "The Right to Criticize American Institutions," Douglass declared, "I have no love for America. I have no patriotism. I have no country." And then asked, "What country have I? The institutions of this country do not know me, do not recognize me as a man." Those institutions were the major shapers of American life: the government and the church and the Constitution. He identified those by name, if you will. Given that slavery could not exist without the cooperation of the northern free states with the southern slaveholding states, Douglass declared of the federal government, "I desire to see its overthrow as speedily as possible. As for the Constitution, shivered in 1,000 fragments." This point in his speaking career, he was used to being heckled with racial epithets, pelted with rotten eggs, navigating his way through anti-abolition mobs. And again, this was in New England. His condemnation of the American government and Constitution in 1847 made him few friends among those not already in the abolition camp, which was at the time a fringe element in the 1830s and 40s. And until 1849, Frederick Douglass could not love a country that didn't love him back. To his credit, I believe, and America's, he did not hold this position for long. He eventually claimed America as his country, calling the principles of the Declaration saving principles, and interpreting now, and this is from an 1852 speech, perhaps his most famous, interpreting the Constitution as a glorious liberty document. In a public career that spanned half a century, Douglass joined a vanguard of blacks and whites in the struggle to align the nation's principles with its noblest, to align the nation's practices with its noblest professions. With this conviction, Douglass devoted himself to getting white Americans, as he put it, to trust the operation of their own principles. In this, he foreshadowed Justice Lewis Harlan's famous lone dissent in the infamous 1896 Plessy v. Ferguson case, which produced the insidious doctrine of separate but equal. There, in the lone dissent, Harlan wrote, "Our Constitution is colorblind, neither knows nor tolerates classes among citizens. In respect of civil rights, all citizens are equal before the law." 30 years before that case, Douglass observed simply that the Constitution, quote, knows no distinction between citizens on account of color, end quote. He believed that the government of all should be partial to none. Here, Douglass noticed a tremendous advantage that black Americans in their struggle for civil and political rights in America, an advantage that they had was that at least most white Americans claimed to believe principles of fairness and equality under the law. This belief was so strong that they put it in writing in their most authoritative documents: the Declaration, the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. It was there for all to see. So when Martin Luther King Jr. remarked, "All we say to America is to be true to what you said on paper," I believe he was channeling the muse of Frederick Douglass. When King said, "Somewhere I read of the freedom of assembly, somewhere I read of the freedom of speech, somewhere I read of the freedom of the press," he drew attention to the same levers of freedom that Douglass saw as he lived among his oppressors. They put it in writing. After all, somewhere I read, there was a time in American history when a portion of white America changed its mind about its founding principles. These white Americans were a minority of the nation, but a large enough minority that they attempted to establish a new country based on new and what they considered to be improved principles, the foremost of which was white supremacy. This, of course, was the Confederate States of America. They made the enslavement of blacks a fundamental principle of their new and improved Constitution, where the old Constitution, the Constitution of Washington and Madison and Hamilton, never mentioned slaves or slavery explicitly until the nation decided to abolish it in the 13th Amendment. The Confederate Constitution expressly provided for its protection in several of its provisions. What lever would a black person have in the Confederacy to secure liberty by the rule of law and courts? To what principles of freedom and equality, government by consent, could a black person appeal in a nation whose foundations are laid and cornerstone rests, according to the Vice President, Alexander Stephens, upon the great truth, Stephens said, that the Negro is not equal to the white man, that slavery subordination to the superior race is his natural and normal condition. Stephens added, "This, our new government, is the first in the history of the world, based upon this great physical, philosophical, and moral truth." Blacks could claim no civil right, no political, no constitutional right in the systemically racist Confederate States of America. They could only appeal to their natural right of revolution. So Douglass concluded that the burden of our demand upon the American people shall simply be justice and fair play. We utterly repudiate all invidious distinctions, whether in our favor or against us, and only ask for a fair field and no favor. Douglass found those principles inherent in the American founding. As President Bill Clinton said in his first inaugural address, our democracy must not be only the envy of the world, but the engine of our own renewal. There is nothing wrong with America that cannot be cured by what is right with America. It is a mark of their perception and fortitude that Africans on American soil, in the face of pervasive racial bigotry, nevertheless became Americans. Denied the vote most of the time in most of the American colonies and then states, blacks still bought into the concept of government by consent of the governed as the only legitimate form of government. Denied membership in most American churches. Blacks still became converted to the Christian faith. As Douglass put it, our hearts believed while they ached and bled. Blacks had taken America at her word. All men are created equal. And believe on the Lord Jesus Christ and you shall be saved. So were intent on making a life and a future for themselves and their posterity in the United States, even in the face of color prejudice. And so, after many a thousand gone, if America was not the land of these many black generations, what land could be? Douglass was unwilling to let their many contributions and sacrifices go unappreciated and unrewarded. An American past for him, not an African one, was where blacks in America should go looking for a heritage to claim as their own. That past included the Declaration and the Constitution. The American belief in human equality and individual rights that led Douglass to reject appeals to black Americans to somehow recover a lost African past. He was a steadfast opponent of black colonization or emigration back to Africa, as it was known. Marcus Garvey was a later champion of that. He thought that it discounted the value of reclaiming their heritage as Americans. And so he said, all this native land talk is nonsense. The native land of the American Negro, according to Frederick Douglass, is America. This argument against the mass emigration of blacks away from America can be applied to African heritage arguments that Douglass believed, quote, weaken the Negro's hold on one country, end quote. I think this is an important observation of Douglass's. For much of white American practice, legal and social, gave black Americans plenty of reasons not to love the land of their birth. Douglass, however, placed great stock in how much blacks had contributed to the growth of America, despite the inhospitable and ungrateful country. And so given that all that Douglass did to promote the uplift of blacks in America, he was not a fan of what was known at the time as race pride. He called it a false foundation and a positive evil. He proclaimed that this is the very thing we're fighting against. For the better part of American history, black Americans wanted nothing to do with a color line that separated them from the rest of the American population. Douglass wrote, it was our enemies who sought to, quote, deepen and widen the line of separation between the white and colored people of this country, end quote. And given that blacks were a numerical minority in the United States, color, they knew, had never been a help to them. What Douglass learned from the writings of, yes, slaveholders like Washington and Jefferson and Madison was that the only relevant minority in America was the minority of one, the individual, whose natural and civil rights were the same as those of the political majority. In Douglass's words, color should not be a criterion of rights. He recognized that the protection of the rights of a specific group, whites, was harming his group, blacks. The politics of racial identity in his day diverted government away from protecting the rights of every individual and towards assigning benefits and burdens according to whatever interest group controlled the government. Douglass concluded, "I know of no rights of race superior to the rights of humanity." A steadfast believer in equality under the law, he did not think that race should be the measure of anyone's constitutional rights. Douglass believed an emphasis upon race was a losing proposition for blacks in America. Instead of equal protection of the laws, Douglass declared, "You lay down a rule for the black man that you apply to no other class of your citizens." So when he was asked the misbegotten, the stupid question, "What shall we do with the Negro when freed?" He hated that question. He answered with 3 words, "Let us alone." "Do nothing with us," he added, "for us or by us as a particular class. I affirm that the broadest and bitterest of the black man's misfortunes is the fact that he's everywhere regarded and treated as an exception to the principles and maxims that apply to all other men." He argued that as long as black people were seen and treated as exceptions, color prejudice would continue, and they would never be seen and therefore never be treated as full members of the American community. Now, let's think about this a little more. Did he really mean that black Americans should be left alone? Do nothing? He went on to explain. "All I ask is give him a chance to stand on his own legs. You see him on his way to school? Let him alone. Don't disturb him. If you see him going to the dinner table at a hotel, let him go. If you see him going to the ballot box, let him alone. Don't disturb him. If you see him going into a workshop, just let him alone. Your interference is doing him a positive injury." It was 1865 when Douglass gave this provocative reply, a time when blacks were not given a chance to stand on their own legs. Instead, they were harassed, persecuted, even killed in their attempts to learn, to eat, to vote, and to learn a trade. To be left alone, as Douglass understood it, did not mean to be left at the mercy of a racist mob. It meant to be protected by government, no more and no less, like every other American citizen. This was true equality under the law, which is why the vote was so important to Douglass. To be freed from an individual legal master, but not allowed to vote, was simply to become the slave of the community. Douglass concluded, where universal suffrage is the rule, where that is the fundamental idea of the government, to rule us out is to make us an exception, to brand us with the stigma of inferiority, and to invite to our heads the missiles of those about us. He gave many reasons why blacks should have the right to vote, but this concern for public opinion, what a ban against blacks voting, taught whites regarding the humanity of black people, and therefore what they were owed by their government was a long-standing priority for Douglass. Blacks were owed the vote because they were citizens. He said that by granting this right, it would, quote, make our government entirely consistent with itself, end quote. On the other hand, anything that made black people a special case in the public eye would undermine their equality as American citizens and as human beings. This actually reinforced a white supremacist mindset. Douglass did not see how the myth of white supremacy could be dispelled if blacks were exempted from the rules that applied to everybody else. With him, color prejudice was the great enemy of racial progress in the United States. And so most of his public efforts on behalf of civil and political rights were directed to promoting policies that eliminated government distinctions based upon race. So he thought, instead of living as an exception to the rules that applied to others, blacks should integrate with the majority white population as much as possible. They should endeavor, quote, to make themselves and be made by others a part of the American people in every sense of the word. Whites needed to recognize that their destiny was tied up with the destiny of blacks. And so he encouraged blacks to avoid segregation. We should distribute ourselves among the people, build our houses, where if they take fire, other houses will be in danger. Common dangers create common safeguards. Near the end of his life, he put it this way: it is better to regard ourselves as a part of the whole than as the whole of a part. It is better to be a member of the great human family than a member of a particular variety of the human family. For Douglass, the way to eliminate racial bigotry was to become part of the wholeness upon which America was founded. This led him to preach the principles of human equality and the equal rights of American citizenship. I believe that the extent to which race remains a part of our laws and institutions may explain why we fall short of reaching unity as American citizens, achieving that elusive unum out of the pluribus that is our manifest diversity as a people. So as we reflect upon the life of Frederick Douglass, may he serve as a guide for our own time. In honoring Douglass, we honor the best America has to offer in the service of human equality and our constitutional way of life. Thank you.
That was fantastic. Let's give another round of applause for Dr. Morell. Well, I know that you all have learned a lot today. I know I've learned more. I want to start off just with this thought, Dr. Morell, and that is, you mentioned, and it was mentioned, about Frederick Douglass being the most photographed person in the 19th century. He was, by all accounts, a superstar. I mean, he was a celebrity of his day. Even today, he is embraced by virtually everybody. I mean, all political spectrums. So if you are a libertarian, they claim Douglass. If you are a modern conservative like myself, we claim Douglass. If you're a liberal, you claim Douglass. Explain why you think that Frederick Douglass just has this universal appeal.
Yeah, I would say I'll qualify that with just a little bit by saying that there are some in America who don't claim Douglass precisely because he's so liberal in his understanding of what all human beings deserve and what, in particular, all American citizens deserve from their country, from their government. Some are so shaken by the ways, the manifest in many ways this country has not been just towards everyone, that they have rejected and given up on America. Martin Luther King, I'll bring him up again, spoke about that in the early 60s, that there's a group of, in particular, a group of black Americans who had just said, we've had it. We've given you enough time to right your ways, and we're just done. We're just done. We don't believe in America anymore. Interestingly enough, Douglass started there, and he should know. He was born enslaved, okay? But he came to realize that the answer to the problem was actually in the very government, the very institutions that were created by a slaveholding generation. But I think his universal appeal comes back to what I would consider the universal appeal of the self-evident truths of the Declaration of Independence. When it says all men are created equal, you don't take that to a lab, you don't distill it, you don't say, well, I'm not quite sure. What do you mean by men? Give me more examples. No, you know it when you see it. There must be something wrong with your brain, or you might have, as Hamilton put it in the Federalist Papers, some strong impulse of passion or interest that gets in the way of that. But any honest person recognizes that even if we look around this room, the tremendous diversity that we see here, not a one of us in looking around this room would go, human, human, not so sure, human. No, we all recognize, right, tremendous differences. Beauty, sorry, that's the hand you were dealt. Foot speed, intelligence. I mean, there's tremendous diversity, but what we don't mistake is that fundamental sameness. We don't mistake our humanity. That's what the Declaration means when it's a self-evident truth. It cannot be demonstrated. It cannot be proven. You don't assume it. You apprehend it. As soon as your mind beholds it, you recognize its truth. Right? And those who don't do it, there are things, as it were, occluding or blocking their vision. So, long-winded answer to your very simple question, which is, why is he so awesome? Why is he so popular? It's because people recognize in Douglass something that he put his finger on that I argue that the founders put their finger on. Didn't get quite right in practice, obviously, but they figured out, you know what? Let's stop dividing society on the basis of who's got stuff and who doesn't, who's got the power and who doesn't. Why don't we form a society based on what we all possess, what God gave all of us? What is our common birthright? Life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, these sorts of things. So I think that's why across the spectrum, there's a lot in Douglass, not a little, but a lot in Douglass that resonates with pretty much any audience.
To that point, probably every 4th of July, I get, emails from, more of my center-left friends letting me know about that speech that Douglass gave in 1852, I believe it was, in New York, and saying, look, he didn't love America. Look, he chastised, this country. And, the couple of points that I try to raise to them is, number one, please read the speech in its entirety.
Yeah, there you go. Did you read the speech?
And then secondly, this was given before slavery ended. Douglass would give other 4th of July speeches after that. Talk us a little bit about just the evolution. Douglass lived to be over 75 years old, so he was not the same person in the latter years that he was, when slavery ended, than he was in the early years before slavery. So talk about that evolution that I think, some people like to cherry pick parts of Douglass.
I think almost everybody cherry picks.
Guilty as
I
charged.
would say, I think left, right, and center, present company accepted, cherry picks Douglass. I say present company because I do this for a living. Not talk to you all, but I do this with students, and I have to make it a fair fight. I'm not like, I'm just going to pick the parts of Douglass I like. Right? He has an essay, editorial entitled, "Is it wise and just to kill a kidnapper?" Now I've got that guy's attention. It is one of the rare times when Douglass advocates violence on behalf of liberty. Gee, I wonder how this country started. But Douglass makes an argument, you know what? According to the 1850 Fugitive Slave Act, somebody comes to my house and says, you got to be part of the, I'm going to drop some Latin on you, posse comitatus, you grew up watching Westerns, you know what posse is. You couldn't say that goes against my religious convictions, that you're going to go apprehend an alleged fugitive slave. You had to be deputized and go and capture, or else you were jailed or fined. Douglass says, somebody is trying to make me kidnap another person. In that editorial, he said, wise and just to kill a kidnapper? Yes. That's one time he said that. The overwhelming number of other editorials and speeches, he recognized that that actually isn't the most prudent course of action, that the levers of freedom are actually found in the rule of law, that ultimately the very thing that we are being deprived of as black people is the protection of the law. Right. So we can't undermine its authority. Same, King, I mean, for some strange reason, I keep coming back to King. When King argued controversially for civil disobedience, he said, yes, we are going to disobey a particular law to call attention, not to the injustice of government. We need government. Just wish it was for everybody, right? So it says, we're going to call the community's attention to a particular egregious, unjust law, and we will willingly take the punishment. And so in that way, we fortify the rule of law. We support the government that ultimately, when that arc of, what is it, the arc of the moral universe bends towards justice, when it finally hits the earth, doesn't look like an arc right now, it looks like a line going forever, but when it finally comes here, by God's grace, right? When it bends and finally hits the earth, we will have the protection of those laws, the protection of that government. So how do we push without knocking the thing down that we need to protect us?
Are there any points that you would highlight for us today where Douglass had a change of heart or eyes opened? I mean, if I think about myself going back when I was a student at Howard University protesting and shut down the college, I'm not the same person that did that as I am today. But
sorry you did that? Sorry?
I have the paper clippings. But,
okay.
But how did Douglass evolve? What are some points that we might look at to see?
The most fundamental one was one that I made reference to in my speech, was when he comes back from England and he gives his "I'm back" speech, the right to criticize American institutions. He does this in 1847. And at that point, what country have I? I have no country. This country does not know me as a man. It does not know me as a citizen. He says, the only thing that identifies me with America are people who look like me, who are enslaved. I am now no longer outside the law's protection. I'm no longer an outlaw because my manumission was purchased. But the vast majority of my kin are still enslaved. That's what brought me back to America. He could have stayed in the UK. They were begging him to become a British citizen, and he would send for his family, and he ultimately thought, my calling is with my people and is with my country. So that's 1847, when he says the Constitution should be shivered into 1,000 fragments. You don't invite people like that to your parties. That's what the abolitionists were, a fringe. It's hard for my students, 2023, to understand that it wasn't a slam dunk to be an abolitionist at that time. And part of it was because they did not have, some of them did not have the respect for the Constitution.
That's right.
That most of the country did. But what did Douglass do upon returning? He didn't just give speeches. He and another black activist named Martin Delany, who was pro-colonization until he served in the Union Army. He and Martin Delany co-edited the North Star. And so what Douglass did, he was a voracious reader, like Lincoln, self-taught practically, okay? He started doing more reading for himself, and he started reading guys like Lysander Spooner, Wendell Phillips, William Goodell, and a benefactor of his named Gerrit Smith. And he returned to the Constitution. He never lost sight of the Declaration. He was down with the Declaration the whole time. He loved the Declaration. He says those in this 1852 speech, saving principles, eternal principles.
But he says, that Constitution, that's the rub, that's the obstacle in the road for me. Reading those guys and doing his own reading, he said, wow. And we learned this in part from Madison's notes that became available after he died in 1835. He said, this is peculiar. The preamble, the mission statement of the Constitution doesn't say anything about slavery. Why are we using this document in a way to protect something that's never mentioned? That's weird. It talks about the blessings of liberty to ourselves and our posterity. It's in English, liberty. Where is slavery in this thing? And he said, in this 1852 speech, if you stay within the four corners of this document, understood this way, it is a glorious liberty document. He said, the burden is on you to apply this as an enforcing lever for slavery. So the epiphany for him came between 1847 and 1849. 1850, he starts saying out loud, in other words, in his paper, I'm starting to rethink things. I'm starting to dig a little deeper here. In other words, he was preparing us for his greatest speech, which was what to the slave is the 4th of July, delivered not on the 4th of July. I think some of you might know this, that there was a custom among many black communities to celebrate and orate not on July 4th, but July 5th. That was an implicit way, an indirect way of serving notice to those outside the black community. Yeah, we like some things about the 4th, but don't just take this as a day to pat yourselves on the back for what other people did. What are you doing to make your practice align more consistently with the profession of that generation? In that 1852 speech, he says, you guys cry out, we have Washington to our father, right? Like the New Testament. We have Abraham to our father. Jesus says, you don't look a thing like him. Douglass was saying that to his generation. And we all know, or we should know, George Washington had no blood descendants. The only children were through Martha's previous marriage. Right? Washington didn't have any children of his own. We have Washington to our father. We know that ain't true by blood. Yeah, but we look like him. And we live in the United States. He says, you know what? Washington was courageous for his day. Where is your courage? You want to look like Washington? What is left to be done? What was started by the founders that hasn't been finished yet? And so they would celebrate on July 5th as a way of saying, we're kind of late to this game, aren't we? Not we black people. We believed it from the jump. But the greater white majority of the population, you guys need to get on board here. You want to look like Washington? Finish what he started. In that speech, it's remarkable. I said, did you read the speech when they say this? Hey, you should read the speech of Douglass. The first third of it is all praise for the fathers. Right. As men, in other words, in terms of their character and their principles and their risk. And what's the last line of the Declaration? We pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and sacred honor. Never mentions the fact that at least a few of them were slaveholders. Does Douglass not know this? He studiously avoids it because he says, don't let that blur your vision. See past their failures to see what they got right. And that's why I emphasize in my speech, they put it on paper. That was either genius or stupidity. They put it on paper. All. Yeah, last I checked, all meant all. Created. In other words, even before government enters the picture, this is who people are. Okay? He studiously ignores the thing everybody knows is true. Because the point is, what did they get right? Is there anything in our past that can help us fix the things that are still left to be done? And so then he takes out hammer and tong for his generation. That's when he starts lighting into not the founders, but to his current generation. He says, this is what you need to remember. What they did right, now you finish the job.
We're going to go to some audience questions, but Terrace, do we have somebody first from
our online viewing audience.
Yes. Yep, thank you. Someone asked a question online. It said, what would you say was Douglass's most important virtue?
Oh, wow. Most important virtue. I think of a word like virtue, I think very plainly. These are the ways in which a human being is excellent, whether in mind or in soul or character. So many come to mind. I mean, good grief. This guy, again, born with the laws and society, right, formal and social against him, had the courage. He didn't escape the first time, right? He was caught. Somebody gave him up the first time, and he was lucky, if you will, not to be sold to a worse place. His place was bad enough. So his courage is one, but I mean, that was a courage that soon got translated into the conviction that you hear in him as an orator. And so for me, his greatest virtue, we'd have to twin or match his ferocity of spirit and his courage, right? His thumos, as they say in the Greek, his spiritedness, his courage, with his mental acuity. I mean, his just great self-confidence. As I mentioned, he, like Lincoln, basically self-taught, right? There's that great scene in the 1845 narrative where he describes the mistress of the house as this angelic being. She treats him as little Freddie, little Fred, and starting to teach him teach him his letters, teach him how to read, and then the husband comes in and says, "Don't you know that this will unfit him to be a slave?" And then, with a little rhetorical excess, he says, "This angel in my world became a demon on a dime when she was told, stop treating him like your own son, like a little boy who needs to be educated by his mom. Treat him like the mere beasts of the earth." She was the worst person now in the household for him. Just turned on a dime there. He recognized, wow, the thing they don't want me to do, I bet you that's the most important thing for me to do. I may not know all my letters yet. I may not know how they all fit together, but that's the key to freedom. That was the key, he said early on, to his liberation. So in terms of, again, human excellence and virtue, that what I called ferocity of spirit, it was both a thing of his character, his soul, but also a mind that was now going to go as far as it could take him, right? David Blight, in his great biography, Frederick Douglass, Prophet of Freedom, he talks about this book called The Columbian Orator, where it's just this whole kind of potpourri of readings, classical and modern, and he just devoured that thing. My wife, I used to say we homeschooled. My wife homeschooled our three of our four children, and especially my eldest, Luke. As soon as he figured out how letters were put together and how words became sentences, it was like he was off to the races. We would just be checking his work now. There wasn't a whole lot we were doing once he learned how to read, and that was Douglass. And having the confidence now to go on and speak for a living, write for a living.
Yes.
I know I cheated. Those are a few virtues, not just one. Great question, though.
Well, look, what we're going to do is we're going to continue this discussion with our audience here. The Heritage Foundation, we want to thank them for hosting us today. We want to thank them also for some lunch for those of you who are here. And we're going to continue this discussion with Dr. Morell. But let's give him a round of applause. Thank you so very much. Are with us. We're going to continue this conversation, but we also want to make sure that you know that he also has a book that he's willing to sign today, and we will have some great food, again, provided by the Heritage Foundation. So thank you guys so very much. We appreciate your being here. This is the copy of the book that is there, Lincoln and the American Founding. So as we get ready to go to our seat, I saw Horace had a question. So let's go to Horace real quick.
Hi, Horace Cooper. I'm chairman of Project 21. I think I was 10 years old when my grandmother gave me a copy of the Narrative of a Slave by Frederick Douglass, and it has always impacted me, influencing me all the way to adulthood. I'm not going to preach. My question is just, today, what do you see are the values of Frederick Douglass that could apply to some of the issues that we face?
Yeah, what are the values? Given the time, this one I'll try to keep to one, and it's the one that I focused on, quoted it, but then moved on from. But for me, in teaching not just the narrative, for my students, I teach excerpts from the narrative, and then we read a lot of his speeches and editorials, because that's when his mind really unfolds. But what's key in that passage, which is also in My Bondage and My Freedom, is that Douglass, if he wants to teach not just black people, but any person, the key to prosperity and success in life, he says, are there obstacles? Let me tell you. Where was I born again? How does society treat me? I know there are obstacles. Don't tell me I don't know that there are obstacles. But he says, if you want to be free, it ain't going to start out there. You have to find it here first. You look out there, and you will always have an excuse for why things aren't going well for you. So if you want to call it a value, the number one value, or the what do we say today, the takeaway, the lesson from Douglass, if you learn nothing from Douglass, it's that freedom starts here. You have to, all the good in the world out there could change for you. But if you don't find it here first, changes in the law, changes in customs, changes in social practices, So one early speech or an editorial of his, I think it's in 1848, he says that the number one thing that blacks in particular need, and this is well before slavery has been abolished, and good grief, after slavery there's segregation, so that's just half the battle, right? Well before the obstacles were removed, he says the number one thing we need to do is work on our character. He made character essential. He says there's gold in the earth, but you got to dig for it. He says this, our friends can't do for us. It's the only thing we can do for ourselves, and we don't have to wait to start. So I think it's his emphasis on character, and fundamentally that liberation has to happen here. So long before he tried to escape, and long before he was legally manumitted, that came several years after that, he said, I had to discover I was free, even while the laws considered me a slave. I had to discover I was born free. And now the question is, what am I going to do to make that a reality?
Awesome. Well, why don't we get some lunch, sign some books, and continue the discussion outside. Thank you, guys.